everybody, welcome to our coverage of the second episode of the Deadwood series. This one is called Deep Water. We're going to be covering the episode called Deep Water. It's the second episode of the first season. So, I think that to continue our coverage of this, I'm going to largely focus on like one or two themes, I think, in order to make the episodes more bearable and quick and everything like that. So I think the most important thing about Deep Water is that it expands our understanding of where Swearingen stands and how he runs the camp and how he's starting to run the town and take control, or he's been in control since the start, and how he is trying to protect himself from his competition and any sort of criminal activity that might come back to haunt him. So the main way that you see this is told through the Swearingen and Doc Cochrane interaction. And I'll play a quote here, as the series is going to do. We're going to try to use a quote to sort of describe the episode and what we want to talk about. This one, Doc Cochrane is talking to Calamity Jane about the child and why he is not willing to trust Bullock with the truth of the situation. And it doesn't have a whole lot to do with Swearingen at this point, but it does kind of tie into the larger theme. So let's hear that quote.
You're wrong not to trust him. He formed a party that found that little one among all the dead of her family.
Didn't he? And didn't he also shoot a man he suspected in the murders? And if I were to confide in him, when you circulate my optimism, wouldn't he say, when the little one speaks, you'll see I was right. Not the Sioux killed her family, but road agents. And supposing it was road agents, and they hear his talk, where's the little one stand then?
You got a dark turn of mind.
I see as much misery out of them moving to justify themselves as them that set out to do harm.
All right, so Doc Cochrane's quote there is, I see as much misery out of them moving to justify themselves as them that set out to do harm. So what he's saying there is that he thinks that the people who, in this case it's Bullock, who are maybe out to sort of protect the girl or find justice somewhere, might actually cause undue harm to the little girl, like unintentional harm might become of her because of their actions, and trying to justify themselves and what they think is the right thing to do. It might cause harm in the long run, just as much harm as the robbers who killed her family and are trying to kill her here. You could kind of say the same thing about Swearingen. While Swearingen kind of crosses both lines there, where he does seek to cause harm in a lot of storylines, or he does seek to cause harm in a lot of situations, or he uses violence as a way to protect himself. He also uses violence as kind of a secondary effect to control his position. So I guess you could argue that that is kind of a primary effect of what he's trying to do. But a lot of his violence and the harm that comes from him are trying to protect his station in life, and he wants to control Deadwood. He wants to be in charge of this town where he is the central cog. Everything revolves around him. He is the person that everyone has to go to in the Godfather type sense to, if anyone else is trying to make a move, anyone is trying to set up a plot, anyone is trying to set up a business, anyone is trying to sell a drink or sell some prostitution, they have to go through Al first. And so that Al is the de facto ruler, mayor, whatever, president, if you want to say, think of it in American terms, of this small little camp that is starting to become bigger and bigger. And you see the way that he runs things, which is a combination of sort of fear, intimidation, and intense loyalty from his underlings. And it's not like an unquestioning faith. Dan Doherty, who's the big guy who sort of does the murdering, he killed Driscoll in the last episode, and he's the one who goes to Doc Cochrane to kill the little girl in this one. He has a sort of crisis of conscience here, where he's concerned that he has to kill a little girl. It's not easy for him. He is not just a sort of brainless henchman who's going out to do Al's bidding. And him and Doc have a good conversation about what that means and how they're going to sort of get around this and how they're going to get out of this without angering Al Swearingen at the same time. And the way that Doc has worked is sort of like they explain how the Doc and Al relationship works with each other here, where Doc is this kind of doctor who's tending to the prostitutes, but he sees it as almost sort of beneath him, or he's annoyed that he has to do this for Al because he would rather be out there doing better medicine for some of the other members of the town. He has that scene where he takes out his anger and frustration with Swearingen on Alma because she has been requesting, I think it's laudanum. Laudanum is the drug that she's addicted to, which must be some kind of opiate. She is taking that, and she claims to be ill or has some kind of sickness that would need it. And he gets annoyed and fed up with her and says, like, listen, I'm on to you. You don't need this. And I'm willing to give this to you, but don't bullshit me about why you actually want this. And he's that kind of, that's the Doc character, I think, in a nutshell. He's kind of he's wrapped up and aware of his situation, and he's sort of firmly in the middle, I guess you could say, between Bullock and Swearingen and where they stand. He's morally centered, but he's also willing to sort of go with Swearingen when the need be, and he acts out of self-preservation more than anything else, I think. He realizes, like, how far he can push the boundaries, and he's willing to stand up to Swearingen in some situations because I think he realizes that Swearingen needs him. But he is also, he's also sort of in line with what he wants, and he realizes that as the doctor, his best way to keep in Swearingen's good graces is to tend to the prostitutes and everything like that. And he also has a fair doctoring sense, which I think the first episode actually kind of portrays him more as like a mad scientist who's willing to experiment with people, because they have that weird thing where he tends to the John who got shot in the head by Trixie, and they have that really grotesque thing where he pokes the like the piece of metal all the way through the bullet hole in the guy's head to see where it comes out the other side. And I think scenes like that in the first episode set him up as a little bit more of a Frankenstein doctor who is maybe unhinged and a little bit grotesque and very interested in the sort of like morbid aspect of death and everything like that. Maybe not the best doctor in terms of keeping people healthy and healed, but sort of sadistically interested in the suffering and trauma that can cause death, I guess. I might be reading too much into that scene, but that's always how I interpret his opening scenes in the first episode. And so I think the second episode does a good job of really breaking that down and shows you that he is actually a person. Develops his relationship with Calamity Jane, who also gets a great sort of description here where her tough guy act is all an act, or revealed to be largely an act, and that she backs down from Swearingen, which highlights how ferocious Swearingen can be at the same time. But it also, I think it more importantly shows that Jane is all bluster, especially when she's drunk. She dresses and acts like a man and sort of pretends to be the male figure in this very male-dominated universe that she finds herself, but she is also obviously a victim of some intense trauma. It's implied, I think, that she's been raped. If they don't outright say it, I can't remember. But it's implied that she's been raped or sexually assaulted, and that she had a pretty brutal childhood, because she talks to Charlie Utter about how she hasn't been scared like that since she was a little girl. And so she is trying, in an attempt to protect herself from this kind of universe, she pretends to be the male hard-ass character that seems like they would do well. However, the real hard-ass characters, which Swearingen would be one, and Bullock and Hickok, I think, would be another one, sort of see right through that. Bullock doesn't really interact with her all that much. Swearingen punks her, basically. And Bill Hickok always seems to sort of be amused by her. Like, he doesn't take her particularly seriously, but he seems kind of fatherly to her, but you don't get the sense that he takes her as seriously as her bluster would present itself. And the other aspect of this that all the storylines kind of revolving around how Swearingen controls the camp is that the road agents who killed the little girl's family, the Norwegians or whatever they call them squareheads, and I don't know what that's offensive for. It's some kind of Scandinavian term, I think, because they were heading to Minnesota, which I think is where all the Nordic immigrants to America ended up settling. Not all of them, but most of the Nordic settlers ended up in the Minnesota area. The road agents are highway robbers. Like that's just kind of a fancy term for people, criminals who made a living, and they've sort of been romanticized in American history as kind of like the Robin Hoods, but they're not really. They're pretty much just violent thieves. And Swearingen has employed them for some reason. I don't know whether or not he's doing it to keep the area under control, or if he uses it to sabotage competitors or something like that, or he just runs like a mob business where he takes a cut and allows them to have safe shelter at his place as long as they don't try to screw him over or cause any undue attention to his operation in Deadwood. That seems to be the case of what he provides for them. And the road agent thing allows you a insight into how Al Swearingen is on top of everything that goes along. And the scene where he berates one of the surviving robbers, who he slowly reveals to this guy that he knows everything, and the guy is trying to slowly figure out what Al knows and what the truth is that he can tell him. And at every turn that he tells a lie, Swearingen corrects him, and has a lot of threats about I'll kill you if you don't start telling me the truth, and just kind of plays him for a fool. It's the mob bossy aspect of that pairs nicely into the Cochrane story, which is Cochrane and Dan eventually decide that they're going to do the moral thing and not allow this little girl to be killed. And it culminates in they allow Jane and Charlie Utter to take off with her. And they're aware of this because they talked to them before that scene happens. And when they report to Al that Charlie Utter and Jane stole her away, you see this look on Al's. It's a great scene where Al Swearingen is sort of processing all the storylines that are coming to him at that point. And they hear the story about the little girl didn't survive. They hear the thing about Hickok. It's like all this bad news is sort of coming to Al as the close-up is on his face and he's reacting to it. And when Dan and Doc sort of bring that news that Charlie Utter and Jane had taken the little girl and she was going to get away, Al realizes that the only outcome he has at that point is to kill, I think the guy's name is Phil, the last surviving robber, who is not Ron Swanson, who gets shot by Wild Bill Hickok. And so he realizes at that point that he has to kill Phil in order to tie up all the loose ends, as he says, and he does so. And I think that the writing's interesting there because I think if you're not really paying attention, what he does almost seems like an act of grace on his part, when it's really not. He's really just doing the one option that he has at that point in order to limit his liability in what's going forward. He realizes that the girl has got away. He knows that Dan and Doc are lying to him. And a charitable interpretation would be that because he believes that they have done the right thing to save this girl, he will kill this other guy in order to make what Dan and Doc did, to recognize the hopefulness in what they did and the good. And I think that's the kind of optimistic route to look at it. But Swearingen at this point is much more cynical than that. And the reason he kills the guy is to tie up all the loose ends and to close up everything and to make sure that none of this is going to come back to haunt him. And if the girl was there and needed to be killing, I do think that the girl would have been killed at that point. So Dan and the Doc did save her. But Swearingen manages to close things up by committing another murder, which he does himself, which is interesting, instead of having Dan do it. And I think that that's the shadier aspect of the Swearingen side. And I think that the business, if you want to say business, it's because it's still kind of crooked, but the more straight ahead business he does is the scenes where he, Bullock and Saul Starr negotiate the price of the plot that they want to buy from him. And Swearingen the scenes there are really just a great example of how Swearingen has managed to control this town for so long by being very cautious about who he allows in, not allowing either a competition to come in or people like Hickok and Bullock, who would represent a sort of lawfulness to the town that he is taking advantage of. So he's not interested in having some U.S. Marshals running around running a hardware business on the side. He doesn't want that. He doesn't want competition from people who are going to be doing prostitution or drinks or anything, because he's got that market cornered. So his hard line with them is very identifying of the characters and the conflict between them. You get the sense of Bullock as the straight and narrow who doesn't like to do this kind of negotiating tactic. That's why he has Starr go in his place and act as his proxy. But you also get a sense of Bullock is not a particularly good negotiator, because he's not willing to sort of dance around the things like that and be a good sort of barterer or negotiator that you would need to be, where you'd be willing to give a little to get a little, or to be able to meet in the middle. Bullock is the straight arrow who has no time for that. And Bullock's big flaw is his impatience with that kind of shenanigans. He sees what is right and he wants to go at it, and he has a very short temper for things that are not right. And so the reason he gets off so poorly with Swearingen is that Swearingen is the much more poetic and sort of like loosey with language and somewhat insulting, but also trying to trick them into doing something and trying to play both sides and trying to be a more complex negotiating partner. And Bullock doesn't have time for that. Salstar is a little bit of that, but Salstar, you get the sense, doesn't have the backbone to stand up to Swearingen to get the deal that Bullock thinks that they'd be actually due. So the argument there has boiled over into those two, and I think that it's a really nice head-to-head pairing of those two and their different ideologies. The other thing I wanted to mention was one thing that I love about Bullock and Oliphant's portrayal of him is if you watch the way that Bullock walks is a perfect summation of the character. He's so stiff and upright, and he walks very much like he's a robot, kind of. He doesn't have any wasted movement in how he walks around the town. And I think it has to be a choice. And I'm not super familiar with Oliphant's work, but I don't imagine that he walks like that in normal life because it looks very artificial. And it's really a great character design to show this sort of uptight, stick in the mud character is so rigid and so of his own beliefs and of his own person that he even walks that way. It's like it like manifests in his physicality. The other character that does that a little bit is Doc Cochrane, who seems to be living in like a hobbit hut where he lives in like this mud caked building that's very dark. You can't get a light in. The ceiling seems to be very low, and he walks over very hunched. And I always get the sense that he's like a magical hobbit healer who is living in his cave, and people come to visit him, and he's kind of hunched over and walking around in the dark. And I think that the show does a really good job with the physicality of characters in that way. And I think that the actors all do a very good job of inhabiting those characters and really like portraying those traits in terms of their physical characteristics. So let's play the last sick. We'll play another sick burn from Hickok to Jack McCall, and then we'll wrap this one up.
I'm out for a couple.
Go get you some more ammo, Wild Bill. That kind of looks bound to turn.
Your name's Jack.
Yeah, that's correct.
What are you in the game for, Jack?
What am I in it for?
If irritating me's the jackpot, you got the job done.
There, so that's yet another issue at another poker game between Jack McCall and Wild Bill, who Wild Bill appears to be, and we were told this by Charlie Utter in the first episode, that Wild Bill is not a great poker player. Wild Bill seems to have given up on his life to a large extent at this point. He's almost waiting for the gunfighter to beat him, but unfortunately no one else is really good enough to beat him. And this Jack McCall interaction is just further showing how much of a nuisance McCall is to someone who is much physically superior to him, at least in the settings of how violence would be resolved in the Wild West like this. And Hickok shows a good deal of restraint here, which is interesting in what we're going to talk about afterwards. But I like his burn here of if whatever he says about the jackpot. If annoying me is the jackpot, then you've already won, or whatever, is a good burn from Hickok, because these two have a lot of good interactions between them. I guess the one question, I don't know what other people thought, was did Hickok draw prematurely in this? And if he did, what does that mean for the character? I watched it and I don't get any impression that the Ron Swanson character was making any move for his gun. And Hickok seems to have shot him out of a premonition that he would be doing something wrong. And he was correct in that he did mean him harm. However, my understanding of what the show says is that it's wrong for someone to draw their gun before they have a drawn on them, which is interesting. It puts a lot of pressure on not being the defensive person in a gunfight. Like, you have to be a pretty quick draw if someone just means to do you harm, or is the show implying that meaning to do harm is good enough? I don't know, because the way that stands here is a lot of the characters in the bar react to like, well, he hadn't drawn his gun. Like, why did you shoot him like that? And Bullock steps in and says, he did draw his gun, actually. I'm going to be a witness for Hickok. When it doesn't seem obvious that was the case. It seems like everyone else is not agreeing with that and that they thought it was not the case. And Bullock's sort of respect as a straight arrow is the reason that they all accept the fact that the gun was drawn, even if it wasn't. So I don't know. I think that I don't know what that really says about the characters all that much, because Hickok was correct in his premonition or his sort of threat assessment of what was going on, his control, the AI. And Bullock defends his buddy correctly because the guy was going to him. I don't know. I'd be interested in what other people think about that. Because I could have seen the way where Hickok had just shot him. You know, the guy like stumbles for his weapon or something because he's drunk. He's been drinking all day to summon up the liquid courage to go and take on Hickok. If he stumbled sort of drawing his gun and Hickok shot him then, I don't know what that really changes. I guess what they do here is they show you the relationship that's been built between Hickok and Bullock, which Charlie Utter talks about a little bit more, and the differences between them two. And I don't know. It's interesting, but let me know your thoughts. But that's it for Deepwater, which is a really good episode. I like it. It settles more into letting you know how the town works. You build a little bit more of the characters. You get a lot of stuff going. There's a whole bunch of other things that happen in this episode, but we'll talk about those things as they come up in the next episodes. We'll talk about like Brom and his gold claim. We'll talk about Wild Bill. We'll talk about Alma. Talk about Charlie Utter. We'll talk about Farnham. There's a whole bunch of characters. I think Cy Tolliver makes his appearance in the next episode, if I'm not mistaken. Anyway, thank you very much, guys, for listening. Hopefully you're enjoying the Deadwood show. Let me know what you thought about the episode. Let me know what you think about the series so far. Let me know about all of that stuff. And otherwise, I guess I'll see you in a couple days with the next episode, which is called like Reconnoitering the Rim or something. I need to look up how to pronounce the first word in that title. But we'll be back with that one. So thanks very much for listening, and we'll see you next time.